Hello everyone, welcome back. So, when I'm perusing through various Genshin Impact forums like the Genshin Impact subreddit or the Genshin Impact Leaks subreddit, I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions and just straight up random strange questions about Madame Kujou Sara, the general of the Shogunate army. And by those kinds of strange questions, I mean questions like, is Sara C2 useless? Very odd if you ask me. So based entirely off that, it really seems like nobody knows how to play Kujou Sara, and so I'm here to fix that. So let's get into it. Now, before we do, let me just say, don't forget to subscribe. Did you know that 95% of y'all haven't actually subscribed? It's pretty strange if you ask me. So, please, just do it. You know, it doesn't hurt you. And it does make me feel a lot better in the morning. So we do like that. After all YouTubers' state of mind is entirely directly corresponding to their subscriber count. So, help me feel better about myself. Oh my god. Okay, moving on. Let's get into it. Let's talk about some big misconceptions about Kujou Sara. There is this sentiment floating around that Sara is only good in Raiden Shogun teams, specifically Raiden Hyper, either the Kaz or the Chevy variant. Now, I feel like this is partly due to TCS and Spreadsheet Impact players, so take that with a grain of salt, because I really don't think it's that true at all. Now, obviously, it's true that Sara is really good in those teams. That much is for certain. But it turns out Sara is very good with literally anyone who is an attack scaler. And why is that? It's because Sara buffs attack with a flat attack buff. And Sara's flat attack buff isn't actually tied to her ult, it's tied to her skill, which makes it very convenient to use. It also doesn't actively restrict the movement of your team with something strange like, hypothetically, a circle. It also sticks around for 6 seconds no matter where you go on the battlefield, and it doesn't come with a pretty significant debuff, like, again, hypothetically, for example, I don't know, a self-applied, pyro aura that makes you significantly more vulnerable to almost any kind of elemental damage, especially at world level 9. And we also have a Constellation in the form of Constellation 2, which actually makes it even easier to use your flat attack buff by just simply tapping your skill and then swapping to your character. So that's pretty damn good if you ask me. Now, I personally would hate to see a character be made that had all of those problems attached to their flat attack buff. But thankfully, Hoyoverse has been doing a pretty good job at not making characters that spectacularly cringe. So we do like that, okay? Now, moving on, if anyone's interested, look, my C6 Sara with a crown skill running Skyharp gives a flat attack buff of 994, which I believe is the highest we can get at the present moment. Maybe level 100 will become a thing someday, maybe we'll get a 741 base attack bow, we'll just have to see. Now, to that end, because Sara gives a specific attack buff for a lot of characters that actually want to catch those buffs, well, that makes her very good for attack scalers, and therefore some characters that I often pair with Sara who aren't specifically the Raiden Shogun include Lisa, Miko, Navia, Clorinde, and Arlecchino. Now you may notice 3 of those characters are Electro characters, partially because Sara's really good with Electro characters, partially because I'm an Electro main. It is what it is. But you may notice that 2 of those characters are very much not Electro characters. On top of that, if I'm feeling frisky, I even pair Sara up with technically not attack scalers like Tignari and the Higher, because Sara actually works pretty well with Tignari and the Higher. Having Sara's buff versus not having Sara's buff is pretty damn noticeable if you ask me, so I often find it a little bit weird that the general sentiment seems to be that Sara is only ever used with A. No, that is simply not true. Okay, anyone who wants to, have their attack scaling buffed, Sara is right there. So, before we continue with those kinds of teams and explaining how I actually pair Sara up with these kinds of characters, let's just quickly go through Sara's constellations so we have a better idea of what Sara's kit more or less entails. Alright, let's just do a quick rundown of Sara's constellations, because this whole idea that Sara's only ever good at C6 is patently false. So, let's get into it. C1 reduces the cooldown of Sara's skill whenever someone catches Sara's attack buff. or I guess if you're attacking enemies with it. This happens once per 3 seconds. Now this is huge because Sara's buff is tied to her skill, meaning lowering her skill cooldown is fantastic no matter what. Now, this is huge as well with Sara C2 because Sara C2 is one of her best constellations. It's a great big quality of life bonus. I've seen way too many times this question of whether or not Sara C2 is useless. It is not. And to even think that Sara C2 is useless is, in my opinion, a phenomenal take. A phenomenal take that is completely false. When people complain that the quick charge attack from Sara's skill is too clunky, well, guess what? Sara C2 is your solution right there, because it basically means that Sara's buff is effectively tied to just simply tapping her skill. It is very, very good, right? Plus, you effectively get to use 2 buffs from Sara's skill each time through C2, which basically means if you space it out over 3 seconds, you actually get to use 2 rounds of Sara's C1, thus reducing her cooldown by 2 seconds. Her skill cooldown is 9 seconds, so reducing it by 2 is actually a pretty decent portion of that cooldown being reduced through her C1, so we do like that, right? Sara C5 is more attack buff, so we do like that. Sara C3, on the other hand, is more damage, if that's something you're interested in. And just as a side, that is something that you should be interested in because you can build Sara for DPS and not lose anything. So that's really good as well. C4 is mostly a DPS constellation. Now technically there's a little bit of quality of life in there because you do need to stand where Sara's ult lightning hits, so having more ult lightning just sort of spread out does mean it should be easier for you to get it. That being said though, the way I tend to use Sara kind of makes C4 not do anything with regards to making it easier for me to get Sara's buff. But either way, it is an option right there. I think with the math, against single targets, you should be doing about a 20% increase in her ult damage overall. So that's pretty nice. And then finally we have C6, which obviously everyone should probably recognize by now is a very, very good constellation. It's not that Sara C6 is bad. It's that Sara is not bad even without C6. That is my main point right there. But let's just quickly talk about Sara C6 real quick, because obviously electric characters will love it because it gives you a lot of extra crit damage. And there's also one particular character that I already mentioned whose entire kit actually gives her way too much crit rate. Thus, having a character like Sara who can provide an additional crit damage buff through external means is really, really good, right? And that also means you can focus on more crit rate for a lot of your characters, especially your Electra characters. Guess who can also get this buff? That's right, Sara herself. Because this buff is tied to Sara's skill. Sorry, let me repeat that for those in the back. This buff is tied to Sara's skill. Meaning you could use her skill, and because you have C6, you already have C2, you can tap her skill and then Omega buff her ult. Especially at C6. So that's really, really good. And also, on top of that, because Sara's ult also buffs other characters as well, what you can do, which is what I do a lot, is Sara tap skill, get buffed by Sara's own tap skill, and then Sara's ult, then swap. So not only is your ult doing way more damage, well, Sara's ult doing way more damage, but then you're also still buffing the next character on the team, and we do like that. Alright, let's start talking about Sara's teams, because like I mentioned, you don't have to exclusively play Sara with the Raiden Shogun. You can play her with other characters. Let's start off with Navia. So, this one's really, really straightforward. What's great about Sara is that her buff lasts for 6 seconds, which is plenty of time for someone like Navia to get off both shotgun rounds. And I don't just mean, oh yeah, let me just get off both shotgun rounds willy-nilly woohoo. I mean fully loaded shotgun rounds. Lots of extra damage right there. And Navia's shotgun, surprise, surprise, is a shotgun. Anyone who's ever used a shotgun in any other video game knows you do kind of want to get closer to your target in order to do maximum damage. So, Sara's buff not having any movement restrictions makes this a lot easier to accomplish. Now, I've actually compared my Navia's damage with Sara's buff to various other team compositions to see what kind of damage difference I can get. It turns out that Sara's buff actually results in a relatively similar damage output to if I were to run Navia with Medic Mona and Farina. Medic Mona and Farina, two characters that can buff the ever-loving crap out of someone like Navia, ended up with a damage increase that was actually somewhat similar to Sara's damage increase. So we do like that. That is actually pretty damn impressive for Sara indeed. Now, my favorite Navia team involving Sara tends to include Zhongli and Yelan. So we also get some damage increase as well as additional Hydro damage. Woohoo, we like that. And of course with Zhongli, well, Zhongli is Zhongli. You get the shield, you also get some red shred. We do like that. Now that being said, Shilinen is just around the corner. So this team is about to get significantly better thanks to Shilinen. Now, the next character I want to talk about is of course Arlecchino. Now, Arlecchino is very, very good with Sara because Arlecchino doesn't have an absolute need of on-field time, meaning she can be swapped in and out whenever she wants. That also means that you can actually weave Sara in from time to time in order to maintain a full uptime on Sara's buff. So that's really, really good, especially if you have C2, because then you can just tap skill and then later on charge attack and move on with your lives. Now, this is particularly good if you want to chase enemies across Spiral Abyss floors. That's going to be a bit of a running theme moving on. When you need to chase enemies around Spiral Abyss floors like the 4.8 Spiral Abyss, what a bit of a nightmare that was, but hey, at least you don't have to restrict your movement with that one. We do like that, you know. And on top of that, because Arlecchino can be swapped in and out, it does make her actually uniquely good among the Pyro on-fielders, because you don't have to see Sara's crow feathers just wither away or her sort of buff wither away, and then you can't really swap out of the character on field in order to get another Sara buff. So one of my most favorite Arlecchino teams actually happens to be one involving Farina. It's weird to me that a lot of people seem to think that you can't play Arlecchino with Farina, but I've been doing that pretty much since Arlecchino's release. And one of the reasons why I'm able to do that with Arlecchino's release is actually because I like to play with Sara and Medic Mona. That's actually my favorite Arlecchino team. Well, one of my favorite Arlecchino teams. Another variant, of course, that's been very strong is to run Arlecchino with Yelan. And so you can play Arlecchino with Yelan and Sara. And your final slot could be someone like Zhongli, Shilinen, Mika even. You have a lot of options right there. You can also run Arlecchino in overload teams where she shines really, really well. Because Sara is basically an attack buff on top of Chevy's, she's also a great buff to the Electro off-fielder that you probably would want to bring in an overload team. And in my case, that's someone like the illustrious Yaimiko, the Wise and Beautiful. Thus describes my favorite overload team. Now, let's finally talk about Sara and Clorinde. And the reason why I wanted to talk about Sara and Clorinde last is because we're going to leave the best to last. Because whenever I hear the phrase, Sara is only good in Raiden teams, my first thought is usually, hey, you've never played Sara with Clorinde, have you? Because here's the thing, Sara, dare I say, synergizes perfectly, almost, with Clorinde. Now, Sara can first help get these two electro reactions that Clorinde needs to further buff her damage as part of her A1 passive. So that means in a team with Sara and Clorinde, as soon as Clorinde starts blasting, she's pretty much doing as much damage as she can. We do like that. She'll then also get a crit rate increase, but that's a little bit different. Now, that being said though, there is one caveat that I will mention, which is that Sara almost perfectly synergizes with Clorinde if you're playing TF Clorinde, and in a team where TF shines the most. One such team, of course, is a Dendro team, and I can already hear the people screaming in the comments, hey, Fischl exists. I know. Fischl is great too. I'm not denying that. But let's say, I don't know, you have hypothetically, I don't know, let me just think off the top of my head here, the world's strongest TF Haran Clorinde build on the planet, and you just want to lean into that? That's where Sara can help a lot. Now, Clorinde's skill lasts for 7.5 seconds, and Sara's buff lasts for 6 seconds, meaning it's very, very possible, especially with C2, that you can actually just drop a Crow Feather, swap to Clorinde, and then activate Clorinde's skill, and just as you're about to start blasting, that's when that Crow Feather erupts, and suddenly Clorinde gets the buff, thus making Clorinde's damage, but specifically more of her later damage during her blasting periods, be those hits that get buffed by Sara, because especially with the first rotation, because you're trying to get that crit rate up through through Clorinde's A4 passive, that means that, you know, buffing the slightly later hits is a little bit better than buffing the first hits, but it doesn't really matter at the end. On top of that, Clorinde's A1 passive essentially means that Clorinde kind of wants to reach 3000 attack if she can. And it seems with my Clorinde build, with a Sara buff, my Clorinde's attack actually shoots up to 3120. So that's also additionally useful. C2 is also particularly powerful for a TF Clorinde team because you can get into this rhythm of tapping Sara's skill, Clorinde goes brr. Sara quick charge attack, Clorinde goes brr again. And C6 is also particularly good for Clorinde because what is one major part of Clorinde's kit? I just mentioned it. It's her A4 passive. When Clorinde's Bond of Life goes past 100% and then it goes up or down again, her crit rate increases by 10% up to 2 times, i.e. her kit basically gives her an additional 20% crit rate. And she ascends with crit rate as well. And I personally am using Harake Bakafuto, so there's even more crit rate. Meaning, when I have, someone like C6 Sara, that extra crit damage is huge. Because it counteracts with the gigantic amount of crit rate that Sara basically, that Clorinde basically has. So, the Clorinde team that I like the most with Sara involves Medic Mona, because, I might as well have a healer in case, some shenanigans go on. And the wonderful Nahida. Now, I've heard a bunch of people complain that Sara doesn't do enough damage. And first off, hold up. Sara's a support character. Why do you need your support character to do DPS? Your DPS is the one who should be doing DPS. Now, I know in Genshin, for some reason, the word support is actually a term that is used to describe characters like Farina, not necessarily because Farina buffs characters, but because Farina does off-field damage. Some people call Miko a support. I don't mean support in that sense. When I say Sara is a support character, I mean it by like the RPG definition sense. A character designed to bring buffs, to have ways of making other characters really, really strong. You really should not be relying on Sara to do damage because she's trying to buff the character that you should be relying on to do damage. So it's, first and foremost, I think it's a little bit odd to be complaining that Sara doesn't do enough damage. And then secondly, Sara does a lot of damage. What do you mean? She can buff herself, and obviously, maybe instead of yapping, you should start building. So let's actually get into how we can build Sara, because her ult actually hits like a truck if you actually build her for damage, which you should, because like I mentioned earlier, building her for damage doesn't actually result in her losing anything else. Because let's have a look at Sara's ult real quick. At level 12, which is, Constellations, that's the level I have her at, it's 820% scaling, which is pretty big. Plus 6 by 68% of some like extra lightning strikes at C4. It's 4 times 68 before C4. So, because all of that can be buffed by her attack buff and her C6, whew, oh yeah, it does a lot of damage. And also, it's a lot of hits, so you can potentially even look at it from an aggravate point of view, and it all does a lot of damage. So, let's look at how we build Kujou Sara. So, first off, let's look at artifacts. So, generally, I stick with a Noblesse build, because then I get the additional 20% attack buff. This does make her ult slightly more necessary than what I've sort of made it out to be, in the sense that, her buff is tied to her skill and her ult. But when you're using Noblesse, then using her ult makes a little bit more sense. So some ER is not necessarily a bad idea. But that being said, when I run an ER stand, it's not out of necessity. It's just out of preference. So that I can just use her ult a little bit more. But I actually don't need to use her ult. There are definitely times where I don't actually use Sara's ult, and I'm absolutely A-okay with that. According to the in-game statistics, though, the vast majority, like 85% of Sara players out there, they actually run EOSF and really lean into the ult damage even more. So, you know, that's cool. Personally, I find that to be a little bit overkill. But, you know, hey, why not, you know? It's probably more exciting to have rapid-fire ult Sara. So, you know, fair enough. That's an option right there. Now, I'm running ER Electro Crit rate specifically. Not necessarily ER Electro Crit, but crit rate specifically, even though the weapon I'm using is, like I mentioned, Skyharp, which is a crit rate weapon. And that is mainly because, again, that C6 exists. So even though my Sara build has like, what, 93 crit rate, 164 crit damage, the reality is my Sara build is actually 93 crit rate, 224 crit damage. And that's like insane for a 4-star. So obviously, for more damage, you can consider using an attack stand if you want, but of course if you're running EOSF, there is a chance that running an ER stand actually that's a little bit more damage. So test against your test dummy of choice. Now, when it comes to the weapons, now, in terms of 5-star weapons, it's usually a contention between Skyharp and Elegy, and I'm sure we may or may not end up with a bit of an argument in the comments. So, first off, if you have only one of these weapons, then that is the one you should use. Case in point, I don't have Elegy, so I'm locked on Skyharp. That's it. I'm not going to go out of my way to get an Elegy of the end. In a similar fashion, people who have Elegy and don't have Skyharp, then you should go for that. But for the few of us that have both, Skyharp is great, since it has that really high base attack. The highest base attack out of all of the bows at the present moment, which means, of course, her flat attack buff is at its highest so far. So, I don't know, maybe we'll get a 741 bow? We'll just have to see. And it has that crit rate substat, which, like I mentioned, is really good because C6 Sara exists. But at the same time, its passive is crit damage. It's truly one of the most straightforward weapons to use for archers. Now, on the other hand, Elegy is also potentially really good, particularly for vape teams like Arlecchino, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. I'd hazard a guess that using Sara's skill and then using Sara's ult may very well net all of the stacks you need to activate the Elegy buff as soon as you can, which is probably what you want to do. So, Elegy Sara players, let me know what your experience is with Elegy, because again, I don't have Elegy, so I don't really know the answer to that particular question. But either way, upon reading the Elegy buff, yes, it's very, very good, and it's definitely a very solid option for anyone trying to play Sara. Obviously, the flat attack buff goes down by a bit, but that's okay, because the 100 EM might end up making up for that, so that's really, really nice. Aside from those two, it's really just as simple as pick whichever bow you have that has the highest base attack. And so to that extent, unfortunately, Favge is not really something I could recommend. I mean, obviously, Favge is Favge. You get Favge particles out of it. The problem is Favge Warbow has really low base attack. It's the 454 variant of base attack for 4-star bows, which you don't want on a character like Kujou Sara. So unfortunately, that's not really an option. Look, at the end of the day, I think Sara is just a really, really straightforward support character, again, by the RPG definition, who works well in a significant amount of teams and a vast majority of the cast. When Dendro dropped, it actually made it even better for Kujou Sara, because not only could you play, let's say, Aggravate Sara and start doing DPS Sara memes, but also, you can actually play with a whole lot of Electro characters that really benefited from, Dendro, with Aggravate memes and Quick Bloom memes and all that jazz, right? Quicken loves damage percent. Quicken also loves crit damage. So at that point, C6 Sara became even better. Let me know what all of this in the comments below. Hopefully, we can all finally have a better understanding of how to play Sara, so that when people say like, oh, Sara can only be played XYZ, we can at least be equipped to say, no, you can play Sara however the bloody hell you want, and she's absolutely perfectly fine, if not absolutely spectacular, in the role that she has, because that is the role that she has. Being the flat attack buff. That also does quite a lot of damage, actually. And for Electro characters, being a very, very significant boon in every possible way. So we do like that. By the way, hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact action, and until next time, I will see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.
全ての始まりに過ぎない。